Just a heads up, this episode contains discussions of disturbing topics such as child abuse, severe injuries, death, and more. It's not for a younger audience. Please listen with discretion. Hey everyone, welcome back to Generation Cult, a podcast about people who grew up in isolated authoritarian groups, also known as cults, and how they adjusted to the rest of the world after they left their groups. I'm Deanna Levy, and today I'll be interviewing Suvav, who grew up in the 12 tribes and left pretty recently in 2019. He's since helped other family members leave the group and wants to get the word out about its abuses to members. He'll also be appearing on another podcast about the group called Inside the Tribe, which is currently airing new episodes. Suvav, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
We had another person on in our first season from the 12 tribes, a woman named Sammy, who had to get assistance to escape herself, which was quite a harrowing experience. But since it's been a while, and we like people to have at least a basic idea of the backgrounds of the groups we're talking about, I was hoping you could explain to me briefly, if that's possible, what the 12 tribes is.
So, the 12 tribes is, in my opinion, a fallout of people that were disillusioned with reality from the 70s movement. It's possible, at least the way I see it, that the group was founded on some decent principles and good morals and probably a lot of good people that wanted to do something better for society and for their children and whoever they could share that with. That's definitely not what it has currently turned out to be. My personal feeling is that the people that joined early on with those intentions became manipulated by people that were seeking power and rulership over people.
What was the founding principles? Like, what was the point of the group supposed to be?
I think in like Bible related principles, they wanted to be the people that brought Jesus back to the earth, or at least were, in their opinion, the representation of the life that he left behind for his followers.
And did members live communally?
Yes. Their basic belief on what Jesus established was that when he called people to live in community, or that's the way they see it anyway. But I don't think that they based that on the reality of how life was lived. Back then, there really wasn't homes that could house 5 or 6 families. There wasn't single families that gave up houses that invited 5 or 6 more families to live with them. Some of that stuff doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. Like, how did they come up with that particular conclusion? I don't really know.
Well, tell me about the particular community that you grew up in.
Well, that was a lot of different communities because we seemed to move around a lot. I was originally born in Island Pond, which probably anybody that was born in the 80s was born in Island Pond. That was part of the group because pretty much everybody was there in Island Pond in the 80s. From there, they started moving out to other places. I think when I was around 6, we might have moved to Burlington. Then we moved to Rutland, Vermont. Then some point around 10 to 12, somewhere in there, moved to Cambridge, New York. From Cambridge, New York, I moved to West Palm Beach, Florida.
It's a lot of moving.
Yeah, then moved back to Cambridge. From Cambridge, moved down to Georgia, then Georgia up to Virginia, then back to New York. Somewhere in all of that, I just kind of lose track of all the places. I know we lived in Missouri for a little while too.
That's a lot.
Yeah, definitely like very hard to keep track. And even in all those particular moves, we wouldn't even necessarily stay in the same house for very long. You know, like in Rutland, for instance, we moved between 2 different or 3 different houses like a couple times, and it's just crazy. Definitely pretty unsettling for what should be considered normal for a child to have security of any sort.
Yeah. And did they explain why all the moving around? Was it justified in any way?
Definitely not to me. You know, as a child growing up in that, you don't need to understand the whys or the reasons or any of that. And even as I started to grow older, you know, you start trying to think back on some of those situations and say, like, why did they move us here? Why did they move us there? Yeah. I really don't know. A lot of families in the group didn't necessarily go through that, frequent moving around. I always felt like our family was kind of like a special case.
Hmm.
But looking back on it, I feel like a lot of it came down to my dad not really settling or being okay with the way that things were handled or the way that leaders would sort of settle for things. Leaders would get uncomfortable with him being around and sort of opposing them. He'd been there a long time in a sort of respectful way. You should give someone like that validation, but I don't think that he got a whole lot of validation.
Mm. And this was a group that wanted complete obedience, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely not room for your opinion or your variation of truth from them at all.
Mm. What was it like, the places that you live, as far as you can remember? Did you interact with the community at large, like outside of the group, or did they keep you pretty much contained within the 12 tribes?
Yeah, as far as outside stuff, it's not like we were protected from them in a sense of like, don't talk to people that are walking down the street. You're more encouraged to convince them to become part of your way of life. That's really like the thing that's kind of indoctrinated on you from a very young childhood on, and even heavily a part of their educational system. Like, you're homeschooled in the group. And I think every single morning in the group, outside of like the group meetings twice a day, you're taught how the world is and how God is and how we're supposed to be among the world. And so a lot of like your personality and how they judge you or see you is based on how you may try to convert the outside world around you to their way of thinking.
That's interesting. Let's talk about the group's attitudes toward children. How would you say they view children, and how do they expect members of the 12 tribes to raise them?
As far as raising children, it's very spelled out within their sort of what they would consider child training teachings. Like, there's pretty much a set principle for everybody. Clearly, parents have the choice to take those principles and apply them however they see fit. That's sort of something that parents have the power over ultimately.
Mhm.
But when you send your child to their educational system, you're okaying the principles as however the teachers see fit
Yeah,
on your child,
yeah.
which came down to a really extreme amount of discipline. I would say for me personally, the amount of discipline that I experienced versus people that were maybe a little bit more energetic or out of line or challenging to principles. I think I'm just sort of naturally a little bit more of like a quiet challenger in a sense, if you could say that. Like, and then there's people that are just sort of like, no, that's not right. I don't agree with that. Those children experienced like a lot of extreme abuse, in my opinion. It's not okay to be in the realm of trying to discipline a child 10, 15, 20 times a day. That's just, there's something wrong, like fundamentally going on when you think that your discipline needs to sort of rule to that point. I would say that what really started to affect me to the point of changing my perspective on everything was having my own children. And I think when you're a child, you adapt
Mhm.
to your environment to a degree, and you don't know anything else. What you see and experience and who you know is your version of reality. And so, but when you become a parent, you have control of a child's version of reality and you start imposing that on them. There's something morally bankrupt in a human being that accepts that somehow God or Yahshua or Jesus or any figure that stands for good would be not only okay with, but would like commend you for taking those kind of actions against a young individual. Getting to the point where, I had a 4-year-old or 5-year-old that by the time I left, I just kept saying to myself, I can't do this. If it was causing a public scene with my son, I would just take him upstairs and we'd start building blocks together or something. Cause I was just like, you can't be forced to sit still 45 minutes a day, twice a day, just because, someone's going to ramble about Yahshua. It's insane.
How did they expect people to discipline their children?
So when I was young, I think the evolution of discipline went through a lot of different things. But when I was younger, they would use yardsticks, bamboo sticks, go out in the woods, grab a hickory switch, pretty much any kind of form of flimsy stick type thing that would inflict like, a pretty stinging like whip
Mm.
type of thing, which, in their teachings or what they say is that if you inflict pain on a child to save his soul from death, that's a good thing. But I would say, from my perspective now, it's like, again, I'm not one that sits here on the sidelines now in life and says, like, children should never be disciplined. Like, there has to be consequences for wrongdoing in life.
Of course, yeah.
But to take that kind of principle and say every time that your child doesn't say yes dad to you when you give him a clear directive, that's the time that you need to say, okay son, now we're going to go in the room and you're going to get disciplined. I mean, it's like, I have 3 kids now. I tell them to clean up the house, and like, they listen to me for the most part. It's not like they're perfectionists at putting everything in order, but I
Yeah.
don't need to go out and get a hickory switch and come back inside and say, okay, now everybody bend over, we're going to spank your bottom or whatever. It's like the reality of how that got converted from parents holding zero responsibility to children, which is a wrong thing to do, right?
Hmm.
To then saying, okay, now we are going to grossly abuse every single child that does not conform immediately to my every wish, is like a really extreme thing for sure.
Yeah, that sounds very extreme. When you were growing up, did you at any point think this is extreme, or did you just accept it?
There was definitely a few times in my life that I felt that things that I was punished for was just extremely wrong, and it made me very like bitter. I'd say you don't really recover from that kind of thing, especially if you were trying to do the right thing and then somebody sort of mislabeled you. I get that this kind of stuff can happen in life no matter what, but I'd say the consequences I was held to for little things really made me like cold and bitter against life. I
Mm.
remember being, I don't know, probably 13 or something, maybe 14, on this little piece of property down in West Palm Beach. It was about 5 acres or something. And we had chickens and ducks and cows and goats and probably 100 people living on that piece of property too, which was pretty extreme. And one of the ducks got this like horrible infection on its beak, and it was growing up into its eye, and it couldn't see, and it couldn't eat food. And I felt really bad for the animal, and I was like, this is just wrong. Like, I can't
Mhm.
stand to see this animal live like this. And
Yeah.
being a part of a society where you don't, first of all, you don't even like, for people, they don't even call for medical help when things happen. It's all about faith and trust in God and stuff. So something like this was like, all right, well, it's an animal, it's suffering. It would be better that I take its life than for it to live on, in that state. So I talked to the person that was teaching my training or my school, and I said, I just can't stand to see this thing live like this. Can we put it out of its misery? And he agreed to that. So I killed the duck. It's not like I didn't want to kill an animal. It was probably the first animal other than an ant that I'd ever killed. And it was a big deal for me. It was hard to do it. I felt bad, but I also couldn't stand to see it live like that. So then anyway, afterward, somebody else heard something about it, and then they basically labeled me as this like cold-blooded killer that just wanted to kill animals on the farm.
Oh
And it like
no.
really hurt me. And I remember getting like severely punished for that, like beaten hard, like
My
discipline and stuff.
God.
And my father being really upset with me that I would be that kind of person that was cold against animals or something. And I just remember feeling like so hopeless. Like, how does something like this go from me explaining to somebody, like, this can't be, we can't let this animal live on the farm that's dying, to me being labeled as an extremist or a killer or something?
Because you were coming from a point of compassion.
Yeah,
You wanted to help it,
yeah.
and it just turned into the complete opposite.
So I think like there was probably a few things like that happened in my younger life that like really stuck with me. Like, all right, people just are clearly drawing the wrong conclusion from me trying to do the best thing for life as I saw it. But fast forward to being 30 years old and then having your first kid and starting to raise that kid, and you start seeing sort of that same pattern of things where people that were younger than me or even close in age sort of really like railing on me about my child being energetic or just an enthusiast in life. And your kid can't sit still during the gatherings for 45 minutes every day, and like there's really something going on with you and you need to check yourself and stuff. These were really the moments that, like, I would say, aside from having children, I don't know, maybe I would have come to the same conclusion, but maybe I wouldn't have. Maybe it was that sort of responsibility, knowing that was 100% on me at that point to say to myself, I can't continue doing this. This isn't right for these children. I need to find a better path, you know? And it's extremely difficult to walk out of something like that when
Yeah.
you don't have anything, you know? I mean, I have very few family outside of the group. It's not like you have a whole lot of anything to look to or a place to go live or money or anything. They definitely work hard at keeping that power over people where they don't have anything at all. Don't have a vehicle, they don't have bank accounts, they don't have credit, they don't have anything.
So they make people completely dependent on the group.
Yeah, absolutely.
How does that happen? Maybe you can give me an example. I don't know if your parents told you about how they joined or anything like that, but how do they end up getting that much control over people?
I mean, my dad and my mom both joined back in the 70s, and I would say times were very different back then. If it were 1970 right now and I wanted to leave that group, it'd be perfectly acceptable to walk out the front door and stand on the side of the road with a backpack and expect that somebody would pick you up within 15 minutes or something. The world we live in now is very, very different than it was then. And so, like, in a sense, like, to look at my father's life or my mother and say, okay, they were in their early 20s. They saw a bunch of people that were wanting to serve God with all their heart. Let's just say that's all it was, right? Or that's all they saw anyway.
Mhm.
And they said, "Oh, this is great, like we're gonna join that." And my dad loved teaching children. He taught school before he came to the group. He also went to medical school and taught science classes. So his mind was into that realm. So when he joined the group, I think a lot of his mental focus was on teaching children. He did a lot with creative writing, sort of English side of school teaching and science. I don't really know what my mom went through that caused her to join. I think that a lot of people that joined the group sort of had life changing experiences. I know my mom got in a really bad car accident right before she joined the group and nearly died. So sometimes things like that happen to people where they experience like a life altering moment
Yeah.
and then say there was something like this group that just was right there in front of them and they're like, "Oh my God just led me here," or something.
Yeah.
Where maybe it's just more of happenstance than anything that they just kind of fell into that set of circumstances and then those circumstances started taking advantage of them rather than it being a God sent moment. So I think that's if I had to sort of draw a conclusion on why either of my parents ended up in the group, that's the best of my understanding about it at this point.
Okay. And so once someone joins the group, are they expected to give up their possessions or give it to the group? I guess, how do they show commitment?
Yeah, I feel like that's something that the group really majors on. They sort of really take pride in people that walk into the group with, even if it's very little, right? Say you're a biker and all you have is a $12,000 bicycle and some backpacking gear, right? If you join the group and give that stuff up and say they sell it on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or something like that, the group like really says like, yeah, and this man just came and he gave up everything. He gave it to Yahshua. You don't really give it to Yahshua because Yahshua doesn't exist. You give it to the elders of the community or that community. And then they send it to Argentina to buy drugs or whatever they do over there. And that's kind of the reality of it. They turn you into a very helpless individual as quickly as possible. Like they're very, very devout on making sure that members of the group that are not like quote leaders or you're directly involved with one of their group businesses have any sort of means to a bank, financial details, even good credit. It's like completely a no-no. Like there's no room for that kind of thing. And if you are someone that sort of is handy with making friends in the outside world and scoring jobs here and there and making some cash, they're very, very closely watching you and saying, "Oh, how much you make? Oh, okay, so where you gonna give that to the leader? Or what are you spending that on?" Or
Mm,
there's no room at all for people to meet their own needs. Everything is looked at as like it's the common purse. Any money that you make is not your own money; it's our money. But at the same time, a lot of your needs like physical needs or your children's needs or dental or healthcare, any of that kind of stuff is pretty seriously neglected. As a young kid that grew up in the group, I needed teeth work. My teeth were pretty messed up from a young age. I never got it. And even still to this day, like my lower jaw has too many teeth in it, and my teeth are just extremely crowded, and I'm always biting my lips and stuff. But it's not like that's something I've learned how to like live and adapt with. But at the same time, like as a responsible parent of your child, it would only be normal to give your child the attention they need, physically and medically.
Yeah. And I understand that you actually got seriously injured as a teenager and you just didn't get appropriate medical care. What was going on with that? Does the 12 tribes not believe in, going to hospitals, going to doctors? Like, what was behind that?
I think the first thing that was behind it was fear of them being exposed for what actually happened. And then secondly is like no matter what, they really don't trust the medical society, which I understand their bone to pick with things, but I also don't agree. When you go to hospitals in America, there's still choice. It's not like you walk in the door and like, okay, you're ours now. You're our science experiment. We're gonna do whatever we think we want to do with you. That's not the way it is, but that's the way they make you feel like it is.
So people didn't even think of it as an option. Like you'll lose your
Yeah,
freedom if you go get medical
or
attention.
or if you
Wow.
did go, it's because you didn't believe in God and you didn't trust God and
Oh.
you didn't trust the leaders in that community. It's really not at all in reality what any of that comes down to. So it was a Friday, and I got up early and did barn chores, which is you go up and milk the cows, and sometimes there's 10 or 15 gallons of milk to carry back down. Normally did chores around 4:30 or 5 in the morning, so you're starting your day pretty early. The group does not and hasn't ever. I still think they don't believe in eating food on Friday. They believe that that day is set aside to fast and pray for the essential things of the nation as they see it. And I got up early, did chores, then I went and worked in their soap factory in Cambridge, New York. So I was never very interested in the chemistry side of things like my dad was. I sort of always looked for the hands-on physical labor as far as something that I got a little bit more enjoyment or preferred doing. So we were going to build a staircase from like an upper level where they stored all their compound dried goods and stuff like that down to the first floor. So it was about 13 and a half feet. By the time I got up there and started working on all that, we measured it out, marked it out, and I cut it. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I cut the plywood off, pulled that out of the way, and then I went around and cut all the floor joists with a sawzall. Then when I stood up from cutting, I was just completely lightheaded and I passed out. I know I passed out from lack of food and blood sugar or whatever happened in that particular case because I've been through this a few times, not to that extent, but if I have not had proper food or whatever I needed, if I'm working hard and I'm starving hungry and I stand up, I'll get completely lightheaded to the point where I'm incapable of controlling my body.
Mm.
So I fell down on top of everything that I cut and it just gave way. There was plywood on the bottom side of it, but it wasn't enough to hold me up. And I fell right through the floor and landed headfirst
Oh, wow.
on a concrete slab.
Oh.
And then all that stuff fell down and landed on top of me.
Oh, how awful. About how old were you when this happened?
I think I was 13 or 14. Anyway, I landed head first, so at about 13 feet is pretty substantial to hit your head on concrete.
Yeah.
You gain some pretty decent momentum by the time you land. So it knocked me out completely. I was unconscious for about 4.5 hours. They brought me from where I had fallen. They brought me up to their main house and put me like near a fireplace, and they were like singing songs to me and like holding my hand and talking to me and stuff. And I just, after 4.5 hours, I still wasn't coming around. I wasn't talking. I wasn't anything. Just my head was swollen an extra 4 inches or something. So they decided to call the ambulance, and they told them when they showed up that I had fallen out of the hayloft in the barn and hit my head.
Because they didn't want to tell them you were working.
Yeah,
Because they made children work in the group.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
technically, it's okay. Like if you're on a farm, and even still, like if I'm on a farm and my kid's 14 years old, it shouldn't be an abnormal thing for him to be involved in something on the farm.
Yeah.
Now, that's completely different than being required to work every single day, and especially on a Friday after not eating food all day. Imagine if they'd have called an ambulance and they would have showed up at their soap factory and loaded me up off the concrete floor there with all this 2x10s and plywood on top of my head. Like they'd have been like, okay, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Like, social services would have gotten involved. They would have probably taken me away from my parents.
Yeah.
Like the whole thing would have just been a huge deal. But instead, they spin the whole story like, oh, he was just stacking hay bales and like, he just fell and hit his head and he'll be all right. It's such bullshit and extreme lying and manipulation of truth. It's laughable to hear like their take on that stuff. I'm not bitter about this stuff. I'm just happy every day that I am doing what I feel is right for me and my family. But I also really feel it's important to enlighten people on the circumstances and the reality of what children go through growing up there. So they ended up taking me to the hospital. They ran me through a CAT scan. I don't think I had a fractured skull, so they really have any particular reason, technically, according to the law, to keep me in the hospital. Although I remember doctors and nurses and everyone else saying, like, you need to leave him here overnight. He really should be checked up on. They took me home that night, back to the farm. Granted, my dad had spent time in medical school. I think he was technically almost trained to the point of a doctor by the time he joined the group. So it wasn't like he didn't know what he was doing. But at the same time, knowing what you're doing and then not having the tools to do anything or check on anything are sort of things that I really fault the group for, because it'd be as if showing up to a mechanic shop to have your car worked on to someone that was intellectually smart about mechanics but didn't have any tools to do anything.
Yeah.
So he's like listening to your car and he's like, okay, but this is what's going on with your car. I really have faith that we're going to fix your car. But he doesn't have a ratchet and he doesn't have a wrench and he doesn't have a flashlight. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
hold on here. And so, like, that's the way I view them and their medical stuff is like, there really is people there that are actually like intellectually smart. And my dad being one of them, like he knew a lot of stuff, profound stuff about how to help people. But at the same time, they lack a lot of the very, very basic things to physically enact some of those things. And so it's not right. It's not okay to say, like, I'm just going to take the chance. I know my son's head's swollen 3 inches and his eye is completely unable to open and completely bloodshot and his ear's bleeding. But we're just going to take him home and pray to God that he's better. There was no follow ups. There was no doctor checkups. There was nothing. I hit my head so hard that I had to learn how to walk again.
Wow.
It really messed me up. So I don't know. I think that they need to be held accountable for things like that.
Yeah. And this was not an uncommon type of experience. Even your own father dealt with not getting the proper medical care.
Mhm.
Could you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I feel like he knew within his own heart that he had tried his best to do what was right according to how they taught it, how he saw it. And he sent me a text one night saying, I'm not going to make it much longer. I called him right away and I said, where are you? I want to come see you. And he told me he could still talk at that point, but he told me, he said, son, I'm not going to make it that much longer. Don't waste your time. And he was about a 3.5 hour drive from me. And that really hit me hard. I said, well, Dad, can you please go to the hospital or a doctor or something and just get checked out and see what's going on? And he said, no, son, if it's my time, I just want to go. That was a decision that I had to sort of deal with while I was still in the group of, okay, so this is what my dad's saying to me. Do I take matters into my own hands and call 911 and say, my dad's 3.5 hours over here in this building away from me? I know he's not going to make it much longer, but please send help. Or do I say, this is what he said to me, I'm not going to interfere with that? That's something I have to live with. And I let him make that decision, which is still hard for me to think about. But what I don't like is that the people that were there in that house with him also did nothing other than, stand by his side when he was dying. And even after he died, they waited 3 or 4 minutes after he was dead, and they knew he was dead, to call 911 because they didn't want anybody resuscitating him. So
Wow. I'm so sorry.
I think that that's still something that I just think they really screwed up on. They had medical supplies with them. They had oxygen masks. They had the ability to sort of help him live, or at least hold on to life until he could have made it to the emergency room or something like that. But I think that's just an irresponsible thing to wait that long
Yeah.
and say, okay, now he's dead. We're going to call 911.
And what had happened to him? Was he sick?
It was pretty much just out of the blue. It's very possible it could have just been congestive heart failure.
Mm.
I know his father passed away at 65, but according to at least my uncles anyway, that was from the wrong prescription of medicine for his heart.
No, I'm so sorry. And I'm curious to know, was that kind of your breaking point, the death of your father? Because at this point you were an adult, correct? You were an
Yeah.
adult, you were married, you had children.
Yeah.
Did that factor into your decision to leave?
No, I mean, I feel like it made it easier in a way because it's very hard for me to walk away from my dad after knowing that he spent 100% of his energy as a useful member of society invested into that group, which turned out to be nothing but a fraud. So it's very hard for me to walk away from that because I know for him, that's a huge weight on him where he's bared the reality of his children walking away from that. So I'd say, like, my mind had already been made up about leaving
Oh, before that incident.
before that incident. And,
Mm, okay.
but at the same time, it was like, that definitely gave me a little bit more understanding of the reality of the group. And then even how they sort of handled his passing was something I'd never been around at all. Anybody that I'd lived with in the group, I never went to funerals, or really wasn't a lot of people that passed away, I guess, that I knew.
Mm.
But to just see that whole thing and how it played out was disrespectful of life itself. When we picked him up from the funeral home, they just drove like the Yellow Deli produce truck out there to pick him up, and they put him in the produce truck and then drove it back to Hyannis and left it running for the night, and then drove it up to Island Pond, Vermont, and then, like, before anybody even showed up to the funeral or anything, they just like unloaded the casket and dropped it in the hole.
Oh,
And then it was just a time for some people to like say some nice things about him. Again, for me, this not like I've been to funerals, not like I've seen any of this stuff, but like sort of every kind of step of the process where you're like expecting there to be a moment of, respect for the process, or like even the handling of him, or like the fact that, like, here's my dad that passed away in the back of the produce truck, and then they're sending up tea and latte and like food for the event in the produce truck with him. How fucking disgusting and disgraceful is that, to like just mix all that together, send it up in the back of a produce truck and be like, all right, yeah, now we're gonna bury him and like move on and like happily ever after. Like,
yeah, that's
I
shocking.
mean, just like,
Yeah.
yeah, like the kind of thing that I still haven't found words for. I mean, it's just like completely mesmerizing event.
You mentioned the Yellow Deli a few times, and I wanted to clarify that the 12 tribes had or has several successful businesses, and this produce truck that you were referring to that came from the Yellow Deli, which is one of their businesses.
Yes.
And again, I am so sorry about what happened to your dad and also the way it was dealt with afterwards. I can't even imagine having to deal with that. And I would like to talk about your process of leaving. You said you had already been thinking about it before your dad passed away. How long had you been thinking about leaving before you actually were able to leave with your family?
I had sort of, at least within my own mind, made up my mind about 8 months before, 9 months before I left, that I didn't really see anything in the group worth fighting for. I had mentioned it to my wife, and she was pretty reluctant to go along with my belief, and had talked to my father about it and probably somebody else. That kind of stuff really raises eyebrows and doesn't go well at all for someone inside the group murmuring of that kind of thought.
Mhm.
So I just sort of tried to dispel that with everything in me and say, oh, I was just, I was thinking about some things, and that was that. My plan with leaving came down to my wife's sister getting married in the group. I knew that if we left the group, that she would not be allowed to visit her sister or talk to her sister or any of that. So her youngest sister had a wedding coming up. I had told myself to hold out until that happened, and then I'd figure it out. So my dad ended up, at least timing wise, which is not, it just is how it happened. But he passed away a week after I got back from that wedding. So after we dealt with the funeral process, we came back to our community that we were living in, and another thing that really just sort of hit me sideways. We came back on probably a Thursday after burying my dad, and they were hosting like a bar mitzvah for one of the kids in that community. And we were supposed to make the meal for 200 people or something like that. It was just my wife and I on the Friday night
Mm.
meal team. And they're like, "Oh yeah, y'all be back in time to make the meal and stuff. That'll be good. And, we'll try to give you one or two single people to help you make the meal." And I was like, "You got to be kidding me!" My dad passes away, and then they just expect me to roll back into the community
Yeah.
and make a meal for 200 people. Like, what is wrong with these people's brains? Anything other than, oh, no, that's self centered. Don't think that way. Your dad passed. He's up there looking at you. This is what he'd be doing if he was here. Again, these are still things that I don't even have words for. Like, I think back on this and I'm just like, I can't even believe that we went through that. So, like, we just got back and didn't have any other choice. We just made food for 200 people. And then it was like the weekend of one of those sort of Jewish festivals. I don't know if it was Shavuot or Sukkot or something like that. And so they keep those festivals. So then, like the following day, we're all supposed to be rejoicing and playing tambourines and like running around and stuff. And the elders were like really having a problem with me that I wasn't participating. I was just floored. I don't know what kind of reality you all have ever been through or experienced, but you don't just like go bury your dad and then show up and make food for 200 people and then just jump up at 7 o'clock in the morning and head out on the streets and start playing a tambourine, rejoicing.
That would be abnormal.
Like I was just like in every way completely finished.
Yeah.
With people and their requirements and their version of reality.
They know what they're doing is wrong. And that's why they keep it a secret. That's why they hide it. It's hidden.
They were 5 hours grilling and grilling and grilling. I was exhausted emotionally, spiritually, and I was thinking about my dead baby.
Then you would have said, don't listen to them. Satan's talking to you, is trying to take you away from the community, from God and Yeshua.
Hi, I'm Tim Elliott, an author and journalist. I first wrote about a religious sect called the 12 Tribes in 2007, and the story has only got stranger from there. Take a listen to our new podcast, Inside the Tribe.
And so I just kind of put up with whatever and went through that weekend. I had some work that I was personally doing for people outside of the group that I needed to finish. I finished those jobs during the next week. And then I told a couple of the leaders in the community in Hyannis, I said, I'm leaving Friday with my children. We're going for a little camping trip just to kind of reflect a little bit right now. We just need that time. And so they said to me, oh, that's really nice, but we think that you and your wife should just go spend time with each other and leave your children here.
What?
And I was like, okay. Like, I don't even have understanding for these people. I said, no, I've been telling my oldest boy was 5 at that point. I said, I've been telling him all week, we're going to spend some time together. We'll probably go fishing on a lake or something. And they looked at me like, how dare you say this is what you're doing? And I was like, I'm not asking you. I'm just telling you this is what I'm doing this weekend. Right? They were like just floored because I don't really walk around treating people like that. Like I like to give people the benefit of like, reason and, hey, what do you think about this? And like, hey, let's do it, even still as like, as somebody now that owns my own business and is a boss of people, like I just don't walk up to people and treat them like that. I'm like, hey, you think we should do it like this? Like this would probably work good, right? Let's try this,
People tend to respond better to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously that wasn't even like in the option of something that was going to work for me. I was just like, I had to look at them and be like, this is what I'm doing. I don't really care what you think. This is what I'm doing. Right. So we left there on a Friday at like 5:00 or 4:30 or something like that. Cause they keep the Sabbath. They think that if you're driving anytime after 5:30 or 6 or something like that, you're breaking the Sabbath. So unless you're sent to go do something with your family, which is just the logic and the reasoning behind this stuff makes your head spin. So we just packed up some stuff for the weekend. I didn't like pack my clothes up or anything, just packed up some stuff for the weekend. I've sort of been somebody pretty handy with tools and repairs and welding and all kinds of stuff for years. So I went to the shop and grabbed all my tools, and I called one of the other people I grew up with that was already outside of the community at that point in time. I said, hey, I'm leaving. I'm going to really need help getting my tools out of here. I don't know if you're able to do that, but that would really help me. And he said, absolutely. I'll just tell me when and I'll show up and grab your stuff. So I put all my tools together in the middle of the room. I didn't tell my wife anything about it. I just went there to our little shop that we were working out of and grabbed some firewood and a grill and printed off some directions. And we drove out to Western Mass, where my younger brother had a house. And I had talked to him about leaving probably a few months before I ended up leaving.
And was he still in the group?
No, he left when he was 17. So he left, I don't know what year, 2010 or 12, somewhere in there. And we were leaving in 2019. So we ended up leaving pretty late in the day. So I drove out there and he just said, why don't you just stay at my house tonight? And then tomorrow we'll go to a campsite. So I took my wife and the kids. We drove up to his house and stayed there for the night. So next day we drove out to the campground, which was really nice. It was like a beautiful little pond. He had a little John boat there and some fishing gear and stuff like that, and a little camper so you could cook meals and stay inside and stuff. It wasn't a completely uncivilized situation. So we camped there. Didn't say anything about anything. It just was like, all right, we're going to enjoy an awesome camping trip. And then on Sunday night, we still hadn't packed up anything as if we were going home or anything like that. So I told my wife, I said, hey, we're not going home ever. This is what I decided to do. And I sort of planned this out. And she was like, okay, well, I'm not wearing these clothes anymore. And she's like, honestly, I just can't even imagine going back there right now. It's just been like 2 days of absolute peace. And like, I just can't imagine like walking back in that house and dealing with that anymore. So that's kind of how I broke out of that. I mean, from there, I had to call some people back there and say, hey, I'm bringing the truck back, and I'll probably come grab some clothes out of our room. And that's it. We're done.
How did they react to you leaving? Like, did you get any pushback, or did you just so completely separate yourself from them that you just didn't deal with anybody?
So one of the, I would call them New England leaders of the sort of tribal territory of Massachusetts anyway, he said he wanted to talk to me. And I was like, I don't have any reason not to talk. I have my experiences. I drew my conclusions based on that, and I don't mind sharing that with people. So I went back and got all my clothes. And I went and stopped by and saw him and talked for a while. And the thing was that I had already experienced my whole life growing up in there, especially moving around as much as I did, is they're always like, oh, you can move over here and you can live with these people. And I was like, no, the time for things to change and the things that I felt were injustice or how people treated me or treated people around me, I spoke out against and I said things against it, years ago. The time to change is not all of a sudden now because I walked away. Like it's too late.
Yeah.
It's already, it is what it is. I'm just telling you how it is. And that's for you to deal with from here on out. They're not very open to that at all. I drove all the way back out to Western Mass, and two of the younger people that were close to my age drove all the way out there. They didn't even know where I was. They were just like driving around trying to find me and like convince me to come back. And they kept calling me, and I was like, I'm not telling you where I am. Like, I made up my mind. This is what I'm doing. And they're like, well, we're in the area. We really want to talk. I was like, all right, fine. I'll meet you somewhere. I knew my wife was particularly weak to sort of the emotional pull that the group has, especially with her mom still being there and her sisters still being there and stuff. Like, it's really tough. It's even for me as someone that like feels like I'm resolute and stuff. Like, I mean, I don't know if there's ever been a harder experience in my life that I've had to say no. Like, no, you're not getting it. I'm saying no, but like, this is the hardest thing I've ever said no to. So I met them outside the campground somewhere. I was just like, meet me over here. I met up with them. They're like, oh, we just really wanted to come and see your family, and we brought our wives up here. And I was like, I'm just telling you, like, that's not an option right now. I made up my mind. It's very hard for me to say this, but the time for change came and went. It is what it is. This is what I'm doing with my family and my children now. I think in the moment of stepping out of that, it's super, super, super hard to have any kind of like objectivity to say like, okay, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe everything's going to change and I just gave up like one day too soon. But in hindsight, looking back on the group and what it is now and still currently is what's going on there, it's like, no, I made the best decision of my life, you know?
Yeah.
But you live, you know, you grew up in that. Those are the only friends that you ever had. Like everybody that you went to school with. And like I knew people in the outside world. It wasn't like I didn't know names or something, but like I didn't have any friends out here, people that I grew up with or people that I talked to all the time or any of that. I knew a few people, and my feeling on them was that they were good people. They were always honest with me. They always treated me fair. I think sort of like being in a group like that, where you look at somebody that's outside the group, that's just always fair to you and always kind to you, you start to really question things like, okay, so if this person is actually always kind and always fair to me and always good to me, and then like the leaders that are supposedly as holy as Jesus Christ is are really this corrupt, where does good actually stand in this world? You know?
Yeah.
I think that opened my heart up to the point where I could say to myself, no, I believe that there's good outside of this group, and not just good, but there's better people outside this group, and a lot of them. I've really found that to be true over the past 3 years now, or 3.5 years now.
Yeah, I'm curious to know how the last 3 years have gone. I imagine it was a difficult transition.
Yeah, definitely. And still is. It takes a lot to build a foundation, you know, and sort of being 30 years old or 31 when I left, and I'm 34 now, almost 35. It's really difficult to start at that point in life. I think a lot of people, you know, go through it, whether they're immigrants or whatever, you know, and you got to have some grit and determination to just go through the process, you know. But at the same time, a lot of people don't necessarily choose that with 3 children already. So process of like having a house to rent and then starting your own business and having no money, having no fallback protection, having no parents to support you is sort of like a really big and everyday like balance of, are we gonna, you know, we're gonna pull through this month and be able to pay all our bills and put food on the table, which is still 3 years into it. It's like I'm still constantly trying to make sure that there's still enough money at the end of the month to just sort of maintain a few $100s in the account, you know? It's not like after 3 years now I'm like, all right, now I'm established. I have a house. I have
Yeah.
like I have a business. I have a lot of tools. I have a lot of equipment. We have 2 decent vehicles, but you know, it's not like I have money in the bank. I just work every single day and focus on that. We have had a very, very tough time finding housing. We lived in a bus for a year and 3 months with our 3 children because we couldn't find a house to live in. And I said, well, if I buy a bus, I can probably sell it and recoup my money at the end of it. It's not like just a school bus or something. It's actually like kind of like an old tour bus. They're built out and they have all kind of accommodations in them. They're nice things, but it's not easy to live in something like that where you're living in 300 square feet with 3 little children.
Yeah. Sounds noisy.
Oh, it's just crazy. We just moved out of that like 3 weeks ago and found a little 4-month rental on a lake.
So you mentioned that you have your own business. What do you do?
My business sort of started at the time. All I could take on was sort of mobile repair type stuff. So I just bought like a service truck and a welder. And then I would travel around to mainly like people's equipment yards and things like that and do hydraulic repairs or engine repairs or diagnostics on things or welding stuff on big heavy machines and things like that. As time's gone on, I've sort of got into a shop and got a lot more shop fabrication equipment. And that's what I'm focused on streamlining on now. So I do welding of pretty much anything that can be welded.
Okay.
Metal-wise. But a lot of decent money or sort of bulk work that I get into is structural steel for houses. Say someone's doing a renovation, they need to support a wall, they want to take out posts or things like that, so I'll build beams for them and post down to a foundation or a footer or something like that. Or new construction. There's a house I've been working on for about a month now, not far from where I am.
It must feel good to have your own business.
It feels good sometimes, yeah. It's definitely a big burden. You know, from like walking away from something like that where you're like, I just want to do my own thing, you know. It's sort of this utopia, like, I'm going to just run my own business.
Yeah. Not answer to anybody.
And I do love it. I wouldn't trade it for anything. but making money at it, it takes some time building your business to the point where you actually make money.
Yeah.
It's very expensive between equipment and tools and actually gaining enough inventory and equipment and tools to the point where you can start making money off of that stuff. So I don't think I'm necessarily there yet. I'm gaining ground, but I don't feel like I have made it to any sort of goal or great accomplishment yet.
Well, hopefully with time. I mean, it actually hasn't been that long yet.
Yeah, definitely.
And so you recently helped another family member get out as well.
Yes, I did. One of my older sisters, because I still have two older sisters that are still in the community. One of them in May this year decided she wanted to leave the group. She contacted my brother or me and just said, I don't know what to do, but this is what I want to do. So we just both told her, like, it's your choice. We'll support you in whatever you want to do. Obviously, I think any of us that grew up in the group and hear of people that want to leave, we really want to support that with everything in us. But at the same time, we're not looking for that responsibility. I don't want to say it in a way of like, I don't want to help people out there or something. It's like, I'll gladly help people out of there and I'm happy for them when they go. But we have a great burden to bear ourselves. So that's something that like you really want them to be 100% sure on that that's what they want to do. So she was 100% sure on that. And she told us she wanted to get out. And so she was living in Tennessee at the time. So that's, I think if I remember right, around 1,100 miles from Massachusetts. So we drove down there in my motorhome, or bus, and she had spent, about a week, a little bit at a time, packing stuff away and moving it to a different location. Someone that came in the deli or something like that was friends with her that said that she could store some stuff there. So we drove all the way down there and pulled in at this horse farm and waited for her to show up after her kids were out of school and loaded all her stuff up. And then when she pulled in there, she was like just emotionally exhausted from the whole experience of packing things up and leaving everything behind. She hadn't told her husband that she was leaving. So I think for her, that was like a really emotionally difficult thing to process, whether she was going to have to tell her children about that or they didn't know that she was leaving. So when she showed up, she was just crying. She's like, what do I tell my children? And I said, well, just tell them that they came to see their uncle and we're going to take them on a little camping trip. And we're going to all be
kind of the way you did it.
Yeah. I feel like in whatever kind of like family or way that you can be in a difficult situation like that, we were there to sort of make that the best experience for those children. So we left there with all her stuff and her children, and her husband was out on a produce run or something like that, where he didn't even know she was gone until later that night. And then he ended up meeting up with us the following day, and I had him meet up with my brother first and talk because I didn't want him showing up there with all the leaders trying to brainwash her back into joining the group. So seemed like he was on board with supporting her in her endeavor. So we just kept traveling back up to Massachusetts and ended up being that the guy that has an apartment building next to my shop, his tenant moved out the week that we were driving down south to pick them up. And so he called me and he's like, hey, I know what's going on with you and your family and stuff. And like, if you need a place to stay, he's like, it's all yours.
Oh,
so,
that's so nice.
Yeah, talk about timing and people just extending their hearts to you. It couldn't have worked out better. So we just drove back and they ended up moving into the second floor of the apartment building next door where I was renting space. And my sister's husband ended up working with me for 5 months every day, sort of in the shop, welding and fabricating stuff and building things for people. So it worked out great.
Yeah, that's great that worked out. It's so sad, though, that grown adults with their own family have to go through that much just to make what should be a pretty simple decision. I want to move. I want to do something else. But instead, it's this whole process.
Yeah, and one thing my sister said that kind of really struck me too was she said like the whole time she was packing up stuff and moving it out of there with trying to do it when nobody was noticing and stuff like that. She said she went like through the whole week packing her room up and moving everything she had out of there. And she's like, that whole time nobody ever came and checked on me and said, how are you doing? I noticed you're emotionally stressed or what's going on with you. And she said like, that's when it really clicked in me that these people really don't care about me. That's not actually what they're living for, in a positive way to help you unplug from that reality and plug into a reality of here's two people that don't have any money and they're going to just drive 1,000 miles down somewhere and pick her and her children up and turn around, drive back, and, spend a week not making money and whatever else. It's like to put the reality on people that care versus the people that claim they care is pretty black and white when you look at it from that perspective. Like even after they had left, they had, I don't know how much it was, but probably at least 5,000 or 6,000 in pandemic relief funds. And they said like, hey, that's our money. Like, we're just requesting it back because everybody in the group applied for that money. And then they were all supposed to sort of hand their checks to whoever was their community leader or something like that. And even when they left, they were like, it's our money. We're just requesting it back. And they're like, no, you can't have that. We sent that money to Brazil or something like that. Just like, so
infuriating.
Yeah, just crazy to think that people that love God with all their heart, that's what they've turned into,
Yeah.
So
what do you hope to see happen with the 12 tribes, with former members like yourself who've had to leave and go through all of this? Like, what do you hope to see happen in the future, perhaps by, raising awareness about what's happened in the group?
There's a few things I hope, and one is that anybody that supports these people is fully informed on what they're supporting. There's certainly dark people in this world, and we're not going to take freedom of choice away from people because there stands no witness between light and darkness if you do that, But if you're going to support that group, you should know what you're supporting, and it's not a good cause. Beyond just all the technicalities of life and certain struggles that we go through, there's many instances of, not just many, but way too many that I know of personally and have seen people go through and try to recover from sexual abuse and pretty hardcore physical abuse. It's wrong. And so to me, what I hope for is that the whole world could see the reality of it. It's not just an old yellow deli with some barnwood and some old time gatherings playing on the radio. It's people that support that way of life to completely take away power from people to choose what they would innately choose as right and tell them that that's wrong, Like I was talking about when I was growing up, where you're told things like you didn't fall in the soap manufacturing place, you fell out of a hayloft, right? You're told these little things that are like, maybe you could think, okay, for that instance, I see you're wanting to, we're not trying to cause a big scene here, but no, you're actually teaching people to lie about fundamental things that are just wrong.
Yeah.
That's not okay. People shouldn't go through that, and especially shouldn't be forced through that. And then the other thing that I really hope someday people that heavily teach and indoctrinate people to do these kind of things, I hope that they're held accountable. Parents that took those teachings and inflicted them on their children, not only are they accountable, but the people that taught this stuff need to be held accountable. That to me is a big thing that I've thought about a lot, that I don't know how to bring justice to that, but that's something I want to at least cause people to be aware of,
Yeah, because this isn't just some little group off somewhere. Like, this is multiple countries.
Right.
Throughout the United States, can you give me an idea of how far this group spans?
I don't know if I can recall everything, but I know they're in Spain, England, France, Czech Republic.
Wow.
I believe they're in China now. Brazil, Argentina. And then as far as the United States goes, there's Colorado, Missouri, California.
And then Australia, right?
Oh, yeah. That's
outside the United
Australia.
States.
Yep.
Yeah, because that's how we got connected, because of this other podcast
Yep.
being created about the 12 tribes in Australia. Wow, that's a lot of places.
Yeah, where they sort of like blew some headlines where they were, burying bodies on the property without permission. Which, if you were to actually look at the history of things, the exact same stuff happened way back in the 1980s in Vermont. Maybe even after that too. Maybe in the 90s as well. But in Bellows Falls, Vermont, there was at least, a few incidences of children being stillborn, and they just go out and bury them in the field or something.
Yeah, I heard about that. That is just unspeakable. Terrible.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there was some things that politically happened in Vermont where Vermont quit challenging them.
So it's not like nobody's heard of it or nobody's ever made any complaints. People are aware.
Yeah, there's been a lot of situations. I know the FBI has been involved, but the FBI has really become a virtually useless branch of government in the United States. I know they've done plenty of good things, but at this point, they don't fight for what is actually good, in my opinion anyway. Or they at least haven't done anything publicly that we can speak of in the recent years that's been fighting for that. I mean, I know growing up, there was several times where our communities were raided and, snuck out the back door and went and hid in the woods and stuff like that. So, yeah, and then, people were just moved off the property suddenly overnight and stuff like that. And then, they'd send social services in. They'd tell us all what to say, and then, they'd come and ask us if we were abused or if we were fed properly and all that kind of stuff. And we were just like, oh, yeah, like if you answer wrong, your life's just going to turn to hell and nobody's going to care for you and stuff like that, which is, from my perspective now, it's not like I wish to be away from my parents, because that's, I think that's something that every child should have the right to under almost every circumstance, except circumstances where there's extreme abuse going on. But as a child growing up in that group, I was extremely impoverished and very underfed. There was hardly ever enough food around to eat, and I was always hungry. If you look at sort of the grand scheme of it, it's just a weird level of control that, like, people that are power hungry, they seek over other people and they try to lord over you and control you in every possible way. And so, like, every single thing that they can get, like an inroad to control and tell you how to be and what to think and how to eat, they just own you. And so it's sad, but at least it's all in the rear view.
Yeah. Well, I'm really glad that you got yourself out and you got your family out and your children don't have to live that way, because that sounds terrible. And thank you so much for talking to me about all of this. I'm so sorry about what you went through, but I hope that by talking about it and letting people know, hopefully there can be some sort of justice in the future.
Definitely.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Next time, I'll be chatting with an attorney about the ways people harmed in cults are finding justice and what avenues have been most successful in our legal system. Generation Cult is hosted and produced by me, Deanna Levy, with original music by Leanne Dunn and opening and closing music by The Chaw.